Good morning, welcome to Breakfast with Naga Manchetti and Charlie State.
Our headlines today: violence continues between Israeli forces and Palestinian militants as world leaders appeal for calm.
Government scientists meet amid concerns over the spread of the Indian COVID variant.
An extraordinary young man. Tributes are paid to 9-year-old Jordan Banks, who was struck by lightning in his hometown of Blackpool.
Good morning. The great summer getaway, or is it? As one online travel agent cancels all summer holidays until the end of August, doubts emerge over just how difficult it could be to travel this year. So what are your rights to a refund? I'll look at all you need to know.
Good morning. The winding road to the Champions League final. UEFA are expected to announce that the venue will be moved from Istanbul to Porto later today.
Good morning. Today we've got some rain across the southwestern quarter of the UK. It's currently quite heavy, but it will turn more showery as it sinks southwards and eastwards through the rest of the day. But for most of us, it's a day of sunshine and showers. I'll have all the details coming up.
Good morning. It's Thursday, the 13th of May. Our top story this morning. Israel's president has warned of a senseless civil war, and world leaders have appealed for calm as violence continued overnight.
Palestinian militants launched dozens of rockets at Israel after Israeli airstrikes destroyed a tower block in Gaza City and killed some senior commanders.
67 Palestinians and 7 Israelis have now died since the clashes began on Monday. Courtney Bembridge has this report and a warning: there are some flashing images.
It was another night of explosions in Gaza City as heavy Israeli airstrikes and Palestinian rocket fire continued. In the West Bank, Palestinians threw stones at Israeli forces and were met with bullets. In the Tel Aviv suburb of Lod, Palestinian protesters torched a synagogue and confronted motorists.
They heard that my accent was not Arab, ran up to my car and they started throwing stones. I was lucky that there were no cars behind, so I reversed. I drove full gas in reverse. I almost ran into people and cars. I didn't see anything. I saw death. Death. Do you know what death is? People jumping at me with stones, throwing stones at me.
In nearby Petah Tikva, this residential building was hit by a Palestinian rocket. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has vowed to stop the violence.
This is anarchy. Nothing can justify it. And I will tell you more than that. Nothing can justify a lynching of Jews by Arabs, and nothing can justify a lynching of Arabs by Jews. We will not accept this. This is not us, not this violence, not this savagery. We will bring back governance to Israel's cities everywhere, in all cities.
World leaders have also called for calm, and the US President Joe Biden spoke to Benjamin Netanyahu over the phone.
My expectation and hope is that this will be closing down sooner than later. But Israel has a right to defend itself when you have thousands of rockets flying into your territory.
The US is sending a top diplomat to the Middle East to try to de-escalate the conflict, but the Palestinian leader is standing firm.
I direct my speech, especially to America and Israel. We are fed up. Go away from us. Leave us. We will stay like a thorn in your eyes. We will never leave our country. End your occupation today before tomorrow.
The clashes may have started in Jerusalem, but they've now spread across the country, and it may be too late to contain the anger. Courtney Bembridge, BBC News.
Well, let's speak now to our Middle East correspondent Paul Adams, who's in Jerusalem. Good morning to you, Paul. Bring us up to date with what's been happening overnight, and also any more from the politicians.
Yeah, good morning. Well, as you know, there was more violence overnight. There were dozens of rockets that were fired into central Israel from the Gaza Strip. It doesn't sound as though there are that many reports of injuries caused by those. But certainly fragments of some rockets did land in some of the suburban areas of Tel Aviv down on the coast. Meanwhile, the Israelis carried out a whole waves of new airstrikes on targets in Gaza. Clearly, the rhetorical view from both sides is that this still has some way to go. and there's no obvious sign of the Israeli government or the Hamas leadership being willing to down tools and call for a ceasefire just yet. The other thing that is clearly of great concern is that, unlike previous rounds of violence, we are seeing, as you saw in your report just now, this spilling over into confrontations between Israel's Jewish and Arab citizens. That is an unusual feature. It is causing enormous concern among politicians here that the uneasy relationship between Israel's own Jewish and Arab citizens is fraying and in some cases breaking down in the very places where they live side by side. Meanwhile, as you say, calls by international leaders for this all to calm down. We heard from Boris Johnson yesterday, and as you just heard, Joe Biden saying that he feels that this will be over sooner rather than later. We're not quite sure why he should be confident of that, but his envoy is on his way to the region, and I think there is a feeling that an awful lot of diplomacy is now beginning to gather pace.
Paul, thank you very much.
Coronavirus infections in England are at their lowest level since August last year, but the Prime Minister has warned that the highly infectious Indian variant is of increasing concern.
The Government Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies will meet today to discuss the rising number of cases linked to the variant, particularly in some areas of the northwest. Our reporter Charlotte Wright has the details.
Coronavirus cases in the UK are at their lowest since August. But as we prepare to take more steps back towards normality, the government's Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies will meet today to discuss a variant that's causing growing unease.
The threat of this virus remains real, and new variants pose a potentially lethal danger, including the one first identified in India, which is of increasing concern here in the UK.
B1617.2 is one of 3 mutations contributing to India's deadly second wave. And although rates here are relatively low, more than 500 cases have now been identified in the UK, a marked increase over the previous week. Many of these are in Bolton, in Greater Manchester, where surge testing is being carried out. They've been linked to travel back from India before it was put on the red list for hotel quarantine. There's also been a sharp rise among the under-25s, prompting calls at Prime Minister's questions for faster distribution of the vaccine for younger age groups in the area.
A high prevalence of the Indian variants, amongst the highest infection rates in the UK at 150 plus per 100,000. Can the Prime Minister join me in pushing for most of Bolton to be vaccinated ASAP?
The Prime Minister says he's looking at all the potential solutions for these surges, but that is not top of the list at the moment. It's not yet known if this variant will have any impact on the vaccination programme, but scientists say vaccines can be tweaked. There are plans for a third booster dose in autumn if required. And the government is playing down any concerns that it could delay the next step on the roadmap out of lockdown. Charlotte Wright, BBC News.
Campaigners who lost relatives to coronavirus have criticised the proposed start date for a public inquiry into the government's handling of the pandemic, saying spring next year is simply too late.
The Labour Party has also questioned why the independent investigation can't begin sooner. Our chief political correspondent, Adam Fleming, joins us now. Adam, morning to you. So lots of questions before this inquiry even gets off the ground. And shall we be clear, does the inquiry open in spring of next year, or do the tools get put into place?
That's a very interesting question, Naga, because the Prime Minister says the inquiry will officially start in spring 2022. No more detail like a specific date or which month of spring next year, but that doesn't mean work can't start now. So, for example, they'll have to hire a chairperson and maybe some people to sit alongside that person, and maybe an advisory panel of experts to feed in advice and information as the inquiry gets underway. They will also have to design the terms of reference. In other words, what is the inquiry actually looking at, and does it focus into particular areas of the pandemic response? And also people involved in that response, whether it's ministers, government officials or scientific advisors, are already gathering their emails, their documents, papers and WhatsApp messages, which they have been doing for several months. So even though the start of the hearings or the first official moment of the inquiry starting might be some way off, there is still going to be activity over the next few months. And also I imagine there's quite a lot of scope for a bit of politics around this, because different politicians and different government ministers and different interest groups will have different interests in what's investigated.
Adam, thanks very much for taking us through that. We'll speak soon.
£160 million will be spent by NHS England on pilot schemes to tackle the increase in waiting lists since the start of the coronavirus pandemic. The announcement comes as a new report from the Institute for Fiscal Studies suggests hospital admissions for routine surgery in England fell by more than a third last year, with the biggest reductions in the North and the Midlands. In February, the number of people waiting for treatment reached 4.7 million.
All 38 and 39-year-olds in England will be invited to book their first coronavirus vaccine from this morning. They'll be offered the Pfizer or Moderna jab, in line with new guidance from the UK's Vaccine Committee. The decision follows a review which found younger people had a slightly higher risk of developing an extremely rare blood clot after receiving a first dose of AstraZeneca.
See the headlines as they happen and watch BBC News live in the app and get the full story with bbc.co.uk/news. Follow the story for all the latest with BBC News.